Thank Hannah. Yeah, Hannah, I don't know if you're here this morning, but thank you. It just takes a lot of courage to sit in front of a camera and to share your story and to be vulnerable like that and to talk about things that for the most part we'd like to just keep hidden in a closet somewhere, but she was so bold to share her story with us this morning. So thank you, Hannah, for doing that. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yeah. My name is Aaron. I'm one of the pastors here at Livestream. So good to be with you all today. We are in week 4 of our series, The Power of Personal Story. Pastor Chris kicked this series off a few weeks ago. We started off talking about the Apostle Paul and just his story and who he is. And then week 2, Pastor Chris shared his personal story. And I just want to challenge you, if you haven't seen that week, or if you weren't able to attend and you didn't get a chance to hear Pastor Chris share his story, I would encourage you to revisit that. You can go right to our website and check that out. And then last week, Pastor Chris reminded all of us that we are loved, that we are God's masterpiece, and that we are chosen. That is the storyline that runs through all of our stories. And so it was such a fantastic reminder for me and for all of us. So I get to keep the series moving this week. And again, it is the power of personal story. So this morning, what I'd love to do is share just a little bit of my personal story over the last 3 months. But honestly, what I want to do more than that is I want to talk about your story over mine. But I think most of you know, or a lot of you know, that in October, I was diagnosed with colon cancer, and through tests and scans and blood work and surgery and all of that good stuff, realized that it's stage 3 colon cancer. It had moved into the lymph nodes, and so that was back in October. And on December 15th, I was scheduled to go in for surgery to remove a large tumor that they had found. That's how they discovered the cancer. And so on December 15th, I went into the hospital, and I remember part of my pre-operative appointments. I had 2 or 3 appointments before the surgery took place where we'd talk about, what was going to happen. And my surgeon, who is a fantastic surgeon, would take me over to big pictures on her wall of the insides, and she'd start pointing out what she was going to take, and we're going to take this and this and this. And I remember saying, I literally looked at the surgeon and said, "Are you going to leave anything in there?" And so, because she just kept pointing stuff out. And so we had that conversation. But I remember one of the questions I asked was just, okay, how long am I going to be in the hospital? Because nobody wants to be in the hospital for any amount of time at all. And for this particular type of surgery, she had said, 3 to 4 days. That's what's normal for this type of surgery. And so I thought, I can do that. And then you go home and you recover for 4 to 5 weeks. And so I was okay with that. And so I went in on December 15th and had the initial surgery. And by all accounts, everything went well. They got the tumor. They took all the parts and pieces that she promised she was going to take. And she checked everything else as well, right? And the really good news coming out of that surgery is she didn't see any spread. All of the other organs looked really good. And so that was really, really positive. And so I was looking forward to just the 3 or 4 days. And right about day 4, I developed a complication, and I remember the surgeon coming in that morning, one of the surgeons from the surgical team, and I told him, I said, I had this weird thing, and here's this sensation, and is that normal? I said to him, and in the most unalarming way he was able to, he said, that's not normal. In fact, that's very concerning. And so 20 minutes later, I was back in the imaging room getting another CT scan. And 2 hours later, I was in surgery number 2, 4 days later. They had to go back in and redo everything. That surgery was worse than the first surgery, can I just tell you? And 4 days later, I developed complication number 2, which led to more procedures. I ended up being in the hospital for 3 weeks, 3 to 4 days, 3 weeks. And I'll just tell you, just being honest and transparent, it was really the most physically painful experience I think I've ever been through in my life, ever. I didn't know that there were parts that could hurt like that. And yet they did. But I'll tell you this, and I'm only half joking. Even though the pain was horrible, I mean, essentially, for 3 weeks, I wasn't allowed to eat anything. I had like a feeding tube and tubes down my nose, and I could only have ice chips. But the only thing they would let me eat was Jell-O for 18 days. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, Jell-O. Livestream Church, I am making this declaration right now. Every potluck we ever have from this day forward, Jell-O is banned from this place, okay? I don't ever want to see another spoonful of Jell-O. That was probably the worst part of the whole ordeal, I'm telling you. But so all this physical pain, it was 3 weeks, and I just wasn't getting any better. And I remember somewhere around day 10, I looked out the window, it was typical gray Michigan, and I was discouraged and depressed. I was on all kinds of different, narcotics to keep the pain down, but that wasn't working. And I remember somewhere around day 10 is when the depression and the discouragement settled in. And I just remember my wife was sitting next to me, and I just started bawling because I didn't know what else to do. I wasn't getting better. This was day 10 of my 4-day surgery, or my 4-day stay in the hospital. I wasn't getting better. I was getting worse. And the physical pain was enough. But then the mental and the emotional and the spiritual hits you. And that starts to weigh down on you. And it was finally around that day that I asked the question that I'll bet everybody in this room has asked at least once in their life. I'll bet everybody in this room at one point, a situation, a circumstance, an event you've run into in your life, a deep, desperate, meaningful moment, and you've cried up to heaven, you've cried out to God, or you just threw something up at the ceiling, you're not sure if there is a God, but you tossed out this prayer. I finally just started wrestling with this question: why? Why me? Why this? Why now? Why does it have to be cancer? Why does it have to be stage 3? Why am I still in the hospital? Why do I have to go through this? Why? And my guess is if we were being honest, we've all asked that question. And maybe you haven't asked that question because of something like cancer. But for you, it looks a little bit different, but yet you still asked it. For you, maybe it's the divorce. You're sitting in your attorney's office and you're trying to figure out how you're going to share your kids with your soon-to-be ex-spouse, and you're asking, why is this happening? Maybe it is a disease, but it's not cancer. Maybe it's a heart issue. Maybe it's a lung disease. Maybe on Tuesday you're out for a walk, but on Wednesday you're in the hospital because you've had a stroke. We've all asked the question. Maybe it's just depression. Maybe it's discouragement. And you've wrestled through the depression. You've gone to the counselor's office. You've taken the medication. You've done everything you can to try to pull yourself out of it and find a place and a space of joy, but you're just not there. And you've cried out to the heavens and you've thrown up the prayer, why God? Why me? Why this? Why now? Maybe it's the first miscarriage, or the second, or the third, or it's the doctor saying you'll never have children. And you go home and you weep and you ask God why. Perhaps it's a financial crisis. You've lost your job. You've been on unemployment for months, and you can't seem to find another job. And you don't know how you're going to pay your next mortgage payment, You don't know how you're going to buy groceries. You don't know how you're going to provide for your family. And you have cried because you have been faithful to God your whole life. And you shout out to God, why me? Why this? Why now? We have all bumped up against this question. In fact, I wonder if you will be honest with me for just a minute. And this requires a little bit of vulnerability. But how many of you, both online and in this room, would be willing to raise your hand and say, yes, at least one point, I have had a deep, desperate moment where I have cried out this word right here. How many of you would just raise your hand? Okay, now, just for a second, leave your hands up, and look around, look around, look around. That's pretty much everybody in the room. That's everybody. And the reason is because this is just a part of our story. It's a part of the human story. We will continue to bump up against this question over and over and over again. Why me? Why this? Or why them? Why my kids? Why my parents? Why my spouse? Why me? Why this? Why now? But let me ask another question. And this one requires just as much vulnerability and honesty on our part, and you got to raise your hands high for this one. How many of you would be honest enough to say that if you have asked this question, which pretty much everybody said they have, at least once in their life, how many of you would be honest enough to say that I've asked that question, why God, are you allowing this? Why are you doing this? Why me? You've asked that question, and you did not get an answer back to your why. Okay, keep them up and look around. And there's the tension. And here's the thing. We could look at that moment right there, and I think there's a couple of different perspectives. One is that can be very discouraging. It can be very discouraging to think and look around and go, well, apparently God doesn't pay attention to any of us. Apparently he's not listening to any of us because we all raised our hand and said, I have thrown this question out more than once and I've not gotten an answer back to my why. Or we can realize it's not just you. It's not just me that has prayed this desperate prayer and haven't gotten an answer back. But can I make a suggestion this morning? That maybe the reason we all raised our hand, that maybe the reason we've all raised our hand because we haven't gotten an answer to the question why is because we're asking the wrong question. And dare I say, this morning, there's a different question to ask. Dare I say that there's a better question to ask. And that's what I want to walk us towards this morning. Because these moments are going to be with us forever. But what do we do in the why moments, especially when there doesn't seem to be an answer? And I'm telling you this morning, I think there's a better question. So what I want to do is I want to take you to one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's John chapter 11. If you have a Bible, open up to John chapter 11. If you've got an iPad, your phone, we're going to put some verses up on the screen. And I want to tell you, this is a big story. I'm going to pull some snapshots out of the story for us to focus in on this morning, but I would challenge you later today or at least sometime this week to read the whole thing. It's one of the most profound, powerful stories in the New Testament. This is the story of Lazarus, a guy by the name of Lazarus, and specifically it is the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. Let me give you just a little bit of context here. Lazarus is a pretty well-known guy in the community that he lives in. He's well loved. That is evident by the story that we're about to read. He has some wealth, but he's a good friend of Jesus Christ as well. And Lazarus has a couple of sisters, Mary and Martha. You might be familiar with them, who are also good friends of the person of Jesus Christ. They have supported his ministry. They have loved him. And it literally says that Jesus is a friend of Lazarus and Lazarus is a friend of Jesus. Well, one day Lazarus gets sick, and he gets really, really sick, like he's on his deathbed ill. And Jesus is a couple of days away from where Lazarus lives. And so Mary and Martha send a messenger to Jesus to say, hey, your friend Lazarus, the one you love, is sick. And we'd love it, Jesus, if you could show up in this moment. So they send this message to Jesus. Jesus gets the message. And here's the deal. He doesn't move. He doesn't budge. He doesn't leave where he's at. And what ends up happening is Lazarus dies. And Jesus waits for that to happen before he moves. And where we pick up the story is Lazarus has passed away, and there's this big funeral for Lazarus. And tons of people have shown up to mourn and to support Mary and Martha. And Jesus finally decides to come to the funeral. And the conversation that Jesus has with Mary and Martha is so instructive for us this morning when you and I bump up against our why moments. So this is John chapter 11. We pick up sort of in the middle of the story. And here's what John tells us. On his arrival, that's Jesus, he finally shows up. Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days, which is actually a very significant number. John doesn't just throw that in there because it's a detail he feels like putting in there. 4 days is very, very relevant. In the Jewish culture, there was this ancient Jewish belief that a soul could reunite with the body in 3 days, within 3 days. They literally believed that the soul would sort of wander around the cemetery for 3 days, looking for a way to get back into the body. But once the 4th day showed up, it's over. It's done. It's final. And so what John is making sure we know and his readers know, it's final. It's over. It's a done deal. And so he had been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews, that word is going to be very important for us towards the end of the story, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. John goes on. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha says to Jesus. So Jesus shows up. They're face to face. Martha finally has a chance to speak to Jesus. And Lord, Martha said to Jesus, listen to what she says, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. She looks at him and says, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Now listen, I know she's making a statement there, but Martha is just as human as everybody in this room. And if you read that and you sit with that long enough, there's a question right underneath that statement, isn't there? And what's the question? Why? Why weren't you here? We sent you a message. We told you how serious this was. We told you that Lazarus, the one you love, your friend, the one who has supported you, was literally on his deathbed, and you did nothing. You didn't send a message back. You didn't come then. You've shown up now. Why weren't you here? You can hear and see the question. Because she's just as human as everybody else. And here's how Jesus responds. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. To which Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. She's saying, Jesus, yeah, listen, I get it, that someday God is going to make it all better, and God is going to make it right, and at the end of time, there'll be this thing called the resurrection, but that's like 20 years from now, 200 years from now, 2,000 years from now. Martha isn't thinking she's going to see Lazarus in the next 20 minutes. She's way out in the future. So Jesus, thanks for trying to bring me a measure of comfort, but you still haven't answered why you didn't show up. And then I think maybe Jesus pauses for just a second. And he looks Martha right in the eye. And he says, Martha, I need you to hear what I'm about to say next. And this is what he says to her. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. I am the resurrection and the life, and the one who believes in me. This is very important. He's pointing Martha towards him. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? He never fully answers why you didn't show up, why you didn't at least send a message. He gives us this statement about being the resurrection and the life, and that even if we die, we won't really die. And then he says, do you believe this? And I don't know if Martha knows exactly what to do with this moment. So what she does do next is she goes back to the house where Mary is, and she gets her sister. And she says to her sister, Mary, Jesus is here, and he wants to talk to you. And so Mary leaves the house. Here's what happens next. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, Martha goes back to get her, comforting her, noticed how quickly she, this is Mary at this point, got up and went out. They followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. He says next, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, does this sound familiar? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's almost as if Mary and Martha had had this conversation before Jesus showed up. And they said, if he finally does come here, we need to let him know. And we need to ask him why. And Mary does the same thing. Why? Because she's just as human as the rest of us. She's just as human as you or I. And in her deep, desperate moment right here, her brother is laying in a tomb a few hundred yards away. And the guy who could have done something about it is now here, and she wants to know why he didn't show up 3 days earlier. Why, God, didn't you just answer? And then John, he widens the lens. He widens the scope of the conversation. See, up to this point, it's just Mary and Martha. But remember, there's a massive crowd there because Lazarus is well-loved and well-liked. So there's people all over the place. And so there's this huge crowd who have gathered. And somebody in the crowd sees that Jesus has finally shown up. And here's what this guy or gal in the crowd said. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? See, I get it. They're all making statements. But what's just underneath the surface of that one right there? I wonder why he didn't. I mean, we've seen him heal blind people. We've seen him give deaf people their hearing back, lame people their legs back. We've heard stories of him walking on water and calming raging seas. He has fed thousands and thousands of people with a couple of loaves of bread and a couple of fish. And this guy, Lazarus, this is his friend who supported him. I mean, if he could do all of that, Couldn't he do this? I wonder why he hasn't. So now Mary, Martha, and everybody in the crowd, just like all of us, they're doing the exact same thing that we have done. They're looking up to God and going, why? As different as our personal stories are, this is one thing that binds all of them together, isn't it? This experience. And I want to pause just for a second. And I debated whether to share this or not, but I want to pause just for a second because sometimes, especially given the role that I play, right? I'm a pastor. I'm like a professional Christian. What that means. You have a title, study this stuff. Do you know sometimes I feel guilty and ashamed for asking why? I shouldn't be asking why. Not me. I wonder if anybody else wrestles with that. Like somehow, if you were born into the church and baptized and you've been a Christian your whole life, you should never ask why, because all that means is you just have weak faith. You probably don't really trust God all that much. That if you were to ask why of God, he would be disappointed that you're asking why. And I've wrestled with this. And so in the hospital, when I was praying why, it was so odd. It was just like, it was this desperate prayer, but at the same time, I felt guilty for asking it in the first place. Because Aaron, you shouldn't have to ask why. You know all of the right answers. And so I have struggled with this right here. Am I allowed to even ask this question? And I was thinking about just that very thought. And here's what I was reminded of. I was reminded of Jesus hanging on the cross. And Jesus didn't say a whole lot from the cross. He really didn't. In part because he's being asphyxiated. There isn't enough breath to get anything out. But he makes a few statements, but ironically enough, he asks a question. And in Matthew 26, he has been beaten, bloodied, bruised. He's hanging on the cross, struggling for every single ounce of oxygen he can get into his lungs. And in Matthew chapter 26, here's what it says. About 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, you say it. Why have you forsaken me? Forsaken is abandon. Left me behind. Turned your back. It's literally, why have you turned your face away from me? Even Jesus had a deep, desperate moment where in his humanity, gang, think about this. If Jesus were sitting in the audience this morning and I said, hey, how many of you have ever looked up to the heavens and cried, why? He would have raised his hand with you. Just let that sink in for a second. He would have raised his hand with you. And it's as if, here's why this is so powerful for us this morning, because it's as if Jesus is giving all of us permission. Even though I think that there is a better question, Jesus is giving us permission to ask this one. And that it's okay in those moments. It's okay when life seems unfair. It's okay when it hurts. It's okay when it doesn't make sense. To shout out to the ceiling or to God, to get on your knees. It is okay to ask God why, because even God asked why. So he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Let me take you back to Lazarus, though, for a second. So here's how the story unfolds. Jesus has these conversations with Mary and Martha, and then he says, all right, roll the stone away from that tomb. To which, of course, somebody replies, that's a bad idea, Jesus. Like, we know you can walk on water and all that crazy stuff, but this is a bad idea. He's been in there for how many days? 4 days. And literally, this story, if you read this story, somebody says, he stinks. There's a bad odor by now, Jesus. Don't do it. And Jesus says, did you not hear what I said? I'm the resurrection and the life. Roll the stone away. So they roll this stone away. Jesus walks up to the tomb. He offers up a prayer to the heavens. And then he just says, Lazarus, come out. Lazarus, come forth. And there had to have been this long dramatic pause. And sure enough, a silhouette appears in the opening to this tomb, and there stands Lazarus. And everybody's in complete and absolute shock. We would be too. And I know they're in shock because Lazarus walks out. He's still wrapped up in his grave clothes because that's how they would have buried him. Jesus has to say to somebody, hey, go take the grave clothes off of him. Or just stare at him. Take the grave clothes off of him. And so they do that, and they witness Lazarus fully alive. This amazing miracle takes place, and people are shocked. But here's what happens. I'm just telling you, they started asking a very, very different question at that moment. You have this group of people who are all mourning, but they're all asking why. Why Lazarus? Why him? Why now? Why this way? Why didn't God show up? But the minute Lazarus steps out of the tomb and he steps into the crowd, I'm telling you, they started asking a different question. And here's how I know that. Because here's what John says next in this story. He says, therefore, many, there's the many. It's the same many that were asking why at the beginning of the story. Many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. Somebody in the crowd finally, when it happened, somebody in the crowd finally looked up from their lamenting, why? Why have you done this? Why Lazarus? Why now? They look up, they see Lazarus standing there, and in that moment, somebody finally stopped asking why, and they pointed their finger towards Jesus, not Lazarus, and they said, who is that guy? They asked a different question. Who is that Jesus that with mere words just brought that dead man back to life? Who is that guy that apparently has authority over the tomb and over the grave? Who is this Jesus that we've heard about for the last 3 years? This itinerant Jewish preacher, this rabbi, this carpenter who used to whittle wood apparently, but now he stands in front of tombs and he calls dead people back to life. Somebody finally stopped asking why and said, who is that? And then the next person said, yeah, who is that guy? And the murmur that started to flow through the crowd was, who is he? Who is he? Who is he? And bunches of them, many of them, came to believe that he, Jesus, is everything he said he is. And it happened because they chose to ask a different question. And gang, I'm telling you, why will always be a part of our story. It's just a reality. But when you see a story like this, when you see a moment like this, when you see a story like Hannah's, 30 seconds into her video, you heard her say it. Why is this happening? Why God? Why now? Then for the next 3.5 minutes, what did she do? She talked about who God is. She talked about who he's been in her life. And what you saw in Hannah's story and what you see in the story of Lazarus is that our whys begin to shrink in the face of who Jesus is when you understand who Jesus is. And I don't know if they ever fully disappear, but they're just not that important anymore. So who is Jesus to you this morning? And here's the good news for all of us. All throughout the book of John, he actually tells us who he is. There are these things called the I am statements of Jesus, where Jesus says, I am this, and over and over and over again, he tells us who he is. One of them was right there. I am the resurrection and the life. And even if you die, if you believe in me, you will still have life. That means if you find yourself in the why of facing your own mortality, and you want to know why me, why this, why now, that why can shrink in the face of who he is, because my last breath here is my first breath there. Jesus says, I am the bread of life. That's another I am statement. He says, that's who I am. So if you find yourself in the why of why, I don't know why I've lost my job and how I'm going to pay my mortgage and how I'm going to pay my bills and and I don't know why this is happening. Jesus says, I want to be and can be your provision. That's who he is. And trust him to provide for you. Trust him to come through for you. He says, I am the good shepherd. So if you do find yourself laying in a hospital bed, deeply discouraged and depressed, you do find yourself in a courtroom having to share your children, you do find yourself wrestling with depression that seems to just have a grip over your life, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. That's who he is. He wants to shepherd and love your soul and bring you comfort and peace and love, and that's who he is. He says, I am the way and the truth and the life. Hannah OD'd in a classroom in front of her classmates. She had lost her way. She realized who he is. And I remember I watched her video this past week, just the raw cut of it. It hadn't been edited and put together yet. And at the end of her video, Lori and I were sitting back there with Jeff. I started crying, and I didn't really understand why. Why? It's hard to escape, isn't it? But I realized it was because as she told her story, she had so much joy. Did you see it? Even when she's talking about ODing, she told that part of her story with joy, not because that was a fun part, because that's not who she is anymore. That's why. And it's because she figured out who Jesus is. So this morning, here's what we're going to do. Who is Jesus to you? And I tried so hard, gang, to make this like the most non-cliche sounding statement that I could. I just couldn't do it. But the answer to every deep, desperate, meaningful why you will ever ask is found in who Jesus is. Amen. So I'm going to invite the worship team back up. And here's the deal. I want to give you the chance to decide for yourself who he is to you this morning. And here's the thing. Maybe you are the Christian who was born into the church and baptized into the church, and you've been a believer and a follower your whole life. But you're just sort of dabbling with Jesus. He's a good Sunday thing, but I check him at the door. but maybe he needs to become more for you, and maybe you need to surrender something. Maybe you do have a why that you're wrestling through this morning, and I want to challenge you to just surrender that why to who he is this morning. Maybe you're watching or you're in the room, and you've been trying to figure out who God is. You're not sure who this Jesus is, and you've never really given your life to Christ. This morning, can I challenge you to just do that? To come before the holy God, the holy person of Jesus Christ, with all of the whys that you have, and realize he is the good shepherd. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the bread of life. He is the living water. And he wants to love your soul and see you through your why. And the closer you get to the creator of your soul, the more the why begins to shrink. So, Heavenly Father, this morning we want to put before you our whys. Those deep, desperate, meaningful moments where we just don't get it. And we're asking why? Why me? Why this? Why now? And the answer doesn't seem to be coming, but perhaps it's because we've just asked the wrong question. So God, on behalf of all of us, who are you? And I pray, God, that right now in this moment, in our hearts and in our spirits, you will show us and tell us exactly who you are. And I thank you that we could share this moment together as a church. So Heavenly Father, I pray that you speak really clearly and really boldly in this moment to every single one of our whys.